I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Got a big show today. We're going to start with the Lab Leak Media Blackout. We're then going to move to Ben, who's going to talk to us about Tucker Carlson getting some 40,000 hours of January 6th footage. Inez is going to take us through the Equal Rights Amendment debate, which has bubbled to the surface of our political discourse once again. And Josh is going to give us an update on the war in Ukraine, which just hit its 1 year mark. So I will toss it to Emily to begin. Thanks, Emily. We're going to start with the Lab Leak Media Blackout. The Lab Leak Media Blackout came to a head this week as the Department of Energy also released a report saying it concluded a lab leak was the most likely source of the pandemic. Now, there are other government agencies. Christopher Wray, in an interview with Bret Baier just this week as well, said that is the conclusion of the FBI. The Biden administration continues to claim there is no consensus, but now we have two pretty major arms of the government saying that they have done reviews of this and they think a lab leak is the most likely scenario. I say the Lab Leak Media Blackout reached ahead this week because it became, I think, at its best. I mean, here we could look back with the Department of Energy and the FBI and several other parts of the government making these conclusions and look back at the media coverage with almost 3 years, it's hard to believe, in the rearview mirror. We're exactly 3 years. It's March 1st. Imagine what was happening on March 1st, 2020. Things were about to get really rough. And one of those things, I'm going to pull up a thread from Drew Holden here, was the media's discussion of a potential lab leak. So Drew, this is a thread from Drew from 2021 that was re-upped this week, I think rightfully so. New York Times headline, Senator Tom Cotton repeats fringe theory of coronavirus origins. Get that, fringe theory. This is a tweet from the New York Times. In an interview on Fox News, Senator Tom Cotton raised the unsubstantiated rumor that the new coronavirus originated in a high-security biochemical lab in China. The theory lacks evidence and has been dismissed by scientists. Here's CNN. This is on April 13th of 2020. Nearly 30% in the US believe a coronavirus theory. That's almost certainly not true. Almost certainly not true. Now you have a Democratic administration's Department of Energy saying it almost certainly is true. We could just keep going with the coverage here. China hits back at so-called coronavirus, quote, lies by U.S. politicians as war of words escalates. China, that's from CNN, another CNN headline, we urge the U.S. to stop spreading disinformation. I mean, this is just, Tom Cotton is playing a dangerous game with his coronavirus speculation. That's from Chris Cillizza at CNN. Jake Tapper, as Drew points out, took a shot at Tom Cotton as well. You could just keep going. Scientists debunk lab accident theory of pandemic emergence. That's NPR. Virus researchers cast doubt on theory of coronavirus lab accident. I mean, this is amazing. I would encourage everybody just to revisit this thread because now Drew goes into the Washington Post, Politico, ABC, all of these things, NBC, CBS, Business, Bloomberg, Reuters. It's amazing. They're using the phrase conspiracy theory. And I know I'm going on and on and on here, but it's really important, I think, to recognize exactly how crystal clear the media was that this is a conspiracy theory and juxtapose that now with the reality that, again, a Democratic administration is concluding via the FBI, the Department of Energy, that it likely did come from a lab. So you can sort of hammer all day on how absurd and ridiculous this is and infuriating and how it exposes the problems with the media from A to Z. So I want to open it up to the group on that point and get you guys all the way in on the Department of Energy's conclusions that were leaked to the Wall Street Journal, along with Christopher Wray saying that's the conclusion of the FBI as well.
Well, I'll jump in here and say, I hope we don't get to the last stage of the liberal media cycle, which is it's a conspiracy theory. It's not happening at all. It is happening, but it's rare. It is happening, and it's a good thing. I hope we don't get to the good thing part of the normal cycle here. But no, it's very difficult to believe that this kind of blackout is not the result of one theory, a second theory, or both of these, right? One would be the fact that the U.S. involvement in gain of function research is being protected, right? And I'm sure either Ben or Josh will get to Fauci's involvement in some of that. But I think there's a broader point too, and again, I don't think these are contradictory. It is simply that our elites have so many lucrative ties with China, both in and outside of government, that they were very willing not to investigate and to shut down any kind of alternative theorizing about how this pandemic started. And I think that's really the larger problem here. It's very hard to believe that, especially the compliant tech companies and compliant media, right, that this is not all covering, and it doesn't even have to be something that's like sort of cackling or conspiracy theorist minded. It could just be everybody has a good reason to keep China. All of our elites have good reason to keep our relations with China good, even as it seems like we are hardening into a Cold War with the CCP. So it is really frustrating to me, actually. One of the things that frustrated me about Trump during this coronavirus period was that because it immediately became a domestic war for some good reasons, right, about the response to the virus in the United States and elsewhere, there was a huge opportunity, I think, for conservatives, for Trump, to pivot to talk about, okay, why is it that this virus came from China? What did the Chinese government do to contain it, right? How did it originate? And now we're hearing the probably correct theory that it did originate in a lab there, right? All of these questions seem to me to be like very basic first level questions when an incident like this, a black swan event, like the worst pandemic in a century, happens. And there seemed to be very little interest across the board, Republicans, Democrats, two different administrations. There seems to be very, very little interest in getting to the bottom of what actually happened here and making sure that it can't ever happen again. And that is terrifying. That's just terrifying.
So I'll be real quick because I want Ben to probably hop in here. I'm sure he has some more hot, fiery commentary on gain of function research probably than I do. But two very quick points. One is, so I was recently kind of asked, to compare this. I was doing some show, I can't quite remember. I was kind of asked to compare this blackout to the Hunter Biden laptop story and kind of the whole ganking up, the conspiracy theory, disinformation. It's obviously the same playbook that we see over and over again. The Hunter Biden laptop story, why they did it, everything from kind of the Twitter files and nuking the New York Post to the, infamous kind of group of roughly 50 deep state intelligence officials. Why they did it is obvious. They did it to reelect or to elect Joe Biden. Here, the answer or the question is slightly more complex, but, I just have to arrive at the conclusion that I think both Emily and Inez have already kind of intimated, which is it's one of two things or possibly both things, which is one, as we've discussed time and time on this show, the bipartisan uniparty ruling class in America is simply inextricably tied to China and has been ever since kind of the age of globalism, since China's ascension to the WTO in the early 2000s for, maybe arguably going back as far as Deng Xiaoping's liberalizations in the 1980s. But it's been a very long time that our ruling class has been, economically tied with China. So that, combined with whatever gain of function we are doing there, and Fauci has an incentive to kind of spike this story. So that's my best guess as to what's going on there. But I'll defer to Ben on a possible gain of function commentary.
Yeah, so I guess broadly, this follows also the kind of overarching weaponization of favored narratives and suppression of countervailing narratives with respect to the Chinese coronavirus to the favored ends of ultimately oftentimes the Chinese Communist Party and also our Chinese Communist Party colluding ruling class. So yes, obviously, with respect to gain of function, Fauci was a proponent of gain of function. We know about these documents, which they long tried to obscure, about our effective backdoor funding by proxy of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which likely resulted in gain of function projects, which may have resulted in the leak of the creation of and or leak of the Chinese coronavirus itself. Also, always downplayed and suppressed was the obvious fact that WIV was associated with the PLA, and that obviously also raises questions about, was this accidental or was there something more nefarious at play, which is still remains a narrative that you're not allowed to even address or raise attention to the fact that the Chinese Communist Party, of course, had a long-time biological warfare program, and that, of course, if this is a PLA-associated facility or that it's doing research in conjunction with the PLA, then you can't rule out something even more nefarious. But, you know, in terms of the attacking those who raise this narrative, the obvious part of it is any narrative that was backed by, or supported by those who were either conservative or dissented from the overall ruling class narrative on a whole slew of issues associated with the coronavirus had to be suppressed. But this one is particularly important because, of course, the collusion between the Chinese Communist Party and the U.S. I've long held that the reason that our authorities have not wanted to get to the bottom of the origins of the coronavirus is because there would be some U.S. tie, some tie among U.S. agencies in one way or another, and it would make us complicit in the creation and the potential leak of it. And that may or may not prove true, but certainly all the responses from all the actors involved would indicate that they had a vested interest in not getting to the bottom of it. And I can only think at the end of the day, based upon the overwhelming massive evidence that we've seen, that it's in large part because you have to tie it back to U.S. government authorities, which, to the points already made here, just reflect one of the myriad reasons why the relationship between U.S. elites and the Chinese Communist Party has proven so disastrous, as it was also proven disastrous when China threatened to withhold basic pharmaceuticals from us because they control the supply chains of those most basic pharmaceuticals. And the last thing I'll note is that this is one narrative among many that, of course, was in the Chinese Communist Party's interest to bat down. It was portrayed as racist to tie even the coronavirus itself to communist China. And so this was, in effect, our elites engaged in an information operation, an influence effort on behalf of the CCP, as they've done so many times. So with that, I guess we can jump back to myself on another kind of media-related story, which is on the story which broke a couple weeks ago now, that Speaker McCarthy, would be enabling Tucker Carlson to access more than 40,000 hours worth of footage from inside the Capitol and around the Capitol associated with the January 6th Capitol breach. And this follows on a commitment that McCarthy had made to release that footage. It's a little bit vague at this point as to who ultimately will be able to access that footage beyond Tucker Carlson. We do know that there's reporting suggesting that some January 6th defendant lawyers themselves may now be accessing some footage, which raises a basic, obvious question of, well, what about those who have been convicted previously who never had access to this footage? What if there was exculpatory evidence within this trove that's been sat on? That basic questions that haven't really been asked or addressed yet. But obviously, the left responded with great outrage and disgust at the fact that Tucker would be the one who would get the first crack, it appears, at this footage before maybe others in the media and the public at large, which I think is kind of laughable. And I don't think this point has really been made. But we forget, or we shouldn't forget, that the January 6th committee itself selectively leaked clips, of course, to form their favored narrative about that day. And that committee itself was stage managed by former legacy media producers. So this truly, at its worst, if you look at this as, well, this is Republicans trying to selectively leak their favored footage associated with January 6th. At very worst, this is just tit for tat. I mean, Tucker Carlson, at worst, is the equivalent of the legacy media producers who were stage managing for the January 6th Select Committee. Setting that aside, of course, you have to ask questions about why this footage was not released in the first place. And of course, the likes of Chuck Schumer and Benny Thompson and others have claimed, well, this is about a national security threat now posed. It's not just that it's evil Tucker Carlson who possesses the footage and could selectively leak just like we did, but there's also a national security risk at play here. And this follows another playbook that we've seen time and time again when it came back to Trump-Russia collusion, for example, that if you dare expose potentially politicization, weaponization, corruption, incompetence of our authorities by releasing evidence or documents that they don't want released, well, you're going to threaten sources and methods when it came to Trump-Russia. And I think we see the same thing here. Always and everywhere, declassification or redaction, rather, and not being transparent about anything pertaining to national security and law enforcement whatsoever. The presumption always is on the side of those authorities who always claim that it poses a national security risk if we get to see the truth. So kudos to Speaker McCarthy for actually releasing this footage. Now, we do know that there do appear to be strict security protocols that have been put in place on Tucker Carlson's team. Some reporting suggests that they can only view it at the Capitol, and then they have to ask to have certain clips released. We'll see if over time the dam breaks and there is more transparency here. But, what I would raise to the group is, first of all, if January 6th was the worst attack since 9/11 or on the level of Pearl Harbor or the Civil War, wouldn't Democrats want more of that footage released so they can portray the deplorables as the evil domestic terrorists that they purportedly are? Also, if cops acted badly that day, wouldn't Democrats want to know about that too? Doesn't that further one of their favorite narratives? Obviously, to the extent there were provocateurs on the ground, this evidence, this footage should indicate one way or the other whether that's a total conspiracy theory, as has been alleged. So, I think all around, transparency and accountability here would serve the interests of everyone. And it's interesting to see Democrats, of course, opposing it, even many in the media opposing it, particularly because it's Tucker who gets access to the footage. And I think at the end of the day, what we ought to ask is, why wouldn't we have all of the footage released? Do we think that it's legitimate, these national security claims? I asked Jim Banks, by the way, one congressman who investigated and led a counter report to the January 6th committee's report. He totally dismissed the idea that this was a national security threat. Kevin McCarthy has as well, and supposedly a private remark saying, well, look, Democrats released security footage and, it didn't cause a national security concern. Beyond that, the fact that, of course, the Capitol itself was breached when no one had access to any footage whatsoever indicates that the security protocols in place didn't work in the first place. So if this footage is released and people now know where certain cameras are located, shouldn't the Capitol already be hardened against that, given that the breach already happened? So with all that, I open it up to the group. There are obviously a lot of angles here about, the substance of the footage itself, the idea of releasing it to Tucker and not others more widely, that there are these strictures being put in place. Open and interested in your all thoughts on the release of this footage or partial release of the footage.
I mean, I don't have necessarily a hot take that adds much to what Ben said. I guess I will just elaborate on one of the points that Ben made, which is, the old school left used to be all about transparency. I mean, transparency in governance, going back to the Pentagon Papers, right, and stuff like that. This is kind of a sine qua non of the old school liberal left, and I think the fact that various actors on the left maybe don't want us to learn more about what may have happened there on January 6th. I mean, what about kind of the pipe bomber? What about the possibility of feds on the ground? All the reporting that Julie Kelly and Darren Beattie have done, perhaps in particular on this subject. And, it kind of just underscores to me this emphasis on transparency, just, how far I think the center of gravity of the American left has come. The transparency, among other values, has come to be such, a concept not necessarily to be cherished, but to be thrown under the bus. So that is one aspect of this that I don't think we've really emphasized, but it stands out a lot to me, at least.
And let me just interject, and I was just going to interject and say, and obviously Nancy Pelosi appears to be one of the people who doesn't want transparency here, and isn't that telling?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And even if none of this footage changes the broader reality, the broader narrative about January 6th, there are still some huge questions. First of all, we know that there are people acting as informants. The New York Times has reported that at this point in both the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. We know that they had informants in there. So it's possible that there's activity they don't want to expose. Maybe they don't want anything that looks like it would unveil an informant, or maybe that's possible. And I'm sure that's going through government vetting right now. But the other thing is, there are still clearly unanswered questions. What we don't see a lot of are the shots of people being let into the Capitol building, which did happen. I've talked about this before. I was there. That was one of the strangest things to me at the time, just the difference between what was happening on one side of the Capitol, where there was a battle essentially for people to bludgeon their way into the building, and then other sides of the building where people were walking, between the velvet ropes and had just been sort of entered the building more calmly. Is there a failure in strategy? We know that there was a failure in security. Even the January 6th committee, though they de-emphasized that to the chagrin of some of the people working on the committee, we know that they identified, we know that, different law enforcement agencies have identified lapses in their own conduct that day. So it's possible we get more information on that from the footage. I understand why it's being vetted. I don't think that's the end of the world. I do hope that, and I do actually trust that Tucker is going to push for, absolutely everything, given where he's come down on this narrative. So I think it's in as good a hands as can be expected in our media. And I really look forward to getting more answers about that. I don't know that there's going to be anything earth shattering, but I do think it's important that we understand why there was a disconnect between what was happening here in the Capitol and what was happening there in the Capitol, because that did happen.
Yeah, I want to pick up on one of the other threads that Ben mentioned. I think it's been a theme for this podcast for a long time, which is a double standard of justice, right? There's a large there's the sort of post double standard in terms of post event double standard in terms of the way that January 6th people who are charged with crimes during that day have been treated by the system, by the justice system. And this is just what, Ben threw out, like, okay, what about the people who have already been convicted? Has all of this footage been released to the courts privately? Like, these are important questions. The larger point that is actually the same thread is, people will not tolerate the total breakdown of law and order endlessly as applied to one side. This is not something that human nature will tolerate over time. And we've talked about this before with regard to Lincoln's Lyceum address and others, but it is just not realistic to expect that you can jettison the enforcement of the rule of law, in this case for an entire summer, watching city after city burn to the ground in riots, and not engender both vigilantism and sort of criminal activity and rioting on the other side. This is not like a tenable thing. It's an unserious element of the sort of liberal worldview that you can endlessly apply these kinds of one-sided standards and not get more violence. And unfortunately, unfortunately, that was the result on January 6th. I have a really hard time, this is obviously speculative, but I have a really hard time thinking that this actually would have turned out the way it had there not been an entire summer of violence. It was a climate of lack of law enforcement, lack of law and order, and lack of justice that entire summer. And those things have consequences. That climate has consequences. And with that, I will throw it, I guess I'm for the third time, I'm throwing it back to myself. Josh, you have to go last on this one so we can all throw it back to ourselves. So my segment is going to be about the Equal Rights Amendment. There was a hearing yesterday in the Senate Judiciary Committee. My colleague Jennifer Braceras, the Independent Women's Law Center, she testified on against both the substance and the procedural aspects of the Equal Rights Amendment. So there are proponents who are now claiming that the ERA is in fact the 28th Amendment, and all that remains is for it to be inscribed formally into the Constitution. This is complete procedural nonsense. So what they are doing is counting ratifications from the 1970s, 35 of them, and 3 contemporaneous ratifications in Nevada, in Illinois, and Virginia. And they're saying that's 38 states. Congress passed the ERA with a time limit by the 2/3 requisite required majority in both houses, but it passed it with a 7-year time limit. And then there was an extension to 1982, which the legality of which is dubious, in my opinion. But in any case, there was a hard time limit, and that time limit expired. Also, in the intervening time, 5 of the states have either sunsetted or rescinded their ratification from the 1970s of this amendment. So that's the procedural piece of it. And I wanted to get that out of the way. It is not a slam dunk case for us, however, in the courts. If we have to rely only on the courts in this is exactly the kind of question that courts like to not weigh in on and like to punt to Congress and say it's a political question. There are obvious problems with ratifying an amendment over a period of time where the words themselves have changed meanings. So, for example, a discrimination based on sex now could conclude gender gender identity. This is not something that anybody in the 1970s obviously thought they were voting for or against. So there are obvious problems with a long period of ratification. In my view, this process completely guts the spirit of Article 5 and the amendment process, which is to ensure that anything that we inscribe into the Constitution has overwhelming contemporaneous popularity, right? That being said, as I noted, these are the kind of questions that courts have in the past punted to Congress as political questions. So it may very well be that we don't get our redress in the court. To rather just them, I would call it a 60-40. So it remains important to stop this politically. Some proponents claim they don't even need to drop the deadline from Congress, that they don't need an act of Congress, but still most of the proponents acknowledge they do need to pass this through Congress, although for some reason think they need a bare majority instead of the 2/3 that are required for all amendments, because they say this is not part of the amendment. Anyway, there's a lot of legalese that is not that important. The point is that this is an incredibly radical amendment. Its consequences would be very far-reaching. All of the debates that we're having over trans people, right? People who identify as one sex, even though they're biologically the other, in some way would make the ERA would make all of these debates moot, because it would remove the ability of the law to distinguish between men and women in almost all cases, right? So it would make the law intentionally blind to the biological differences between men and women. And in some sense, like I said, this would make the trans issue moot, because Leah Thomas would not have to identify as Leah to swim on the women's team, right? It is only a discrimination on the basis of sex, a recognition that men are different from women, that keeps him from trying out from the women's team, going straight to the top and taking all of those roster spots from women, right? Similarly, it is only a discrimination on the basis of sex that keeps men out of women's prisons. We don't segregate prisons by race, even though doing so would result in less violence. There's a case called Johnson against California from 2005, where the state argues actually, it would reduce prison violence if we were able to segregate by race in terms of prison blocks. But that was considered impermissible under the Equal Protection Clause, right? It's not permissible to discriminate, for the government to discriminate on the basis of race, even when it would prevent violence, right? So if we raise sex to the same level, which is what even the most conservative estimates of the ERA say this would do, it will make the government unable to not have co-ed prisons, right? No state will be able to have, sex segregated prisons, let alone, locker rooms and sports teams and dorms in public universities. TSA agents, you will not have the right to be patted down by somebody of the same sex, right? All of those, there's literally hundreds of these laws that distinguish and recognize the basic differences between men and women. They're all under attack now in the trans context, but this would blow the door open. So with that, I'll kick it back out to you three to talk about the ERA, the procedural element, if you'd like, but also the substance, especially since Republicans are so, it's very annoying to me. There's been a few hearings here, and Republicans have a tendency to call witnesses who only speak to the procedural element of the amendment and not the substance. So fortunately, my colleague Jennifer yesterday was able to speak to the bad substance of the amendment, but Republicans have a tendency only to focus on the procedure.
I love it. Go ahead, Josh. You're a lawyer. You weigh in.
But you're the woman, Emily.
That's right. What we really need is a female lawyer. Oh, I guess we have one. You go ahead though, Josh.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll be quick because we're short on time already in the segment. On the procedural point, I think what Inez is saying about kind of using 1970s era ratification is transparently bad faith. And Ed Whelan of EPBC has done a number of blog posts exposing the bad faith actions here. But I also agree with Inez that relying on that as kind of a way out is totally unreliable. I mean, we have a conservative Supreme Court, but the political question doctrine that Inez has referred to is usually liked by conservatives even more than legal liberals. So that would be a tough thing to rely upon. The substantive point that I want to make here. So we're recording this Wednesday morning. It's night after I did a debate ostensibly on an entirely unrelated subject with Alan Dershowitz here in Miami Beach. We were ostensibly debating Israeli judicial reforms, but like the law professor he took it all over the place. And he basically tried to grill me on the question in the Israeli context, but it would apply just easily in the American context for sex-based classifications in the military. So he basically wanted to say, like, could it just be a purely political question as to whether women can serve in combat? He was using the particular example of Air Force pilots, but it could just as easily apply to everything. And my answer to that question is yes, that is a transparently political question that should be decided by the political process. There is no constitutional right here implicated. And the point is, as Inez, I think, articulate or very ably put it, sex-based classifications can actually make sense sometimes. And that is why they are quite different than, for example, race-based classifications. And in constitutional law jargon, that's why race-based classifications get strict scrutiny, the highest tier of judicial review, and sex-based distinctions, even in our total muddle of constitutional law, still get so-called intermediate scrutiny. So sex-based classifications can actually make a great deal of sense depending on the particular context. And that's kind of the only substantive point I want to hit on.
No, that's perfect. I was going to say, I really love actually that we're having this conversation about the ERA right now, because it's just such a perfect example. I mean, you couldn't have a better way. You couldn't find a better way to illustrate the prescience of Phyllis Schlafly. If you go back and you look at the arguments that were being made about the ERA decades ago, it was just sort of like, well, we're not going to draft women. Are you kidding me? We're not going to have problems with restrooms. Are you kidding me? But the consensus has broken down. And the consensus has broken down because our norms have changed. And that is a consequence of both the government and private actions. I would argue it's more private actions than the government. But these things happened so fast, and they do happen so fast. And Republicans need to make sure that they don't listen to anybody in the future when they say, no. That's ridiculous. What a silly thing to imagine, because we're in a post-truth world now.
If I may jump in just briefly and say that Senator Dick Durbin made exactly the argument, Emily, that you're referencing. He basically called Phyllis Schlafly and said that she was in testifying against the ERA in the 70s when he was around, by the way. And that was making crazy arguments about bathrooms. And I couldn't believe that somebody would be able to look around himself today and not see the prescience of the arguments that Phyllis Schlafly made.
Well, I'll be brief, as neither a woman nor a lawyer, although I play a lawyer at times on podcasts with Emily, which we're just going to keep running that inside joke. But anyway.
Easily confused.
Yeah. Yes.
Like most women.
For better. And for better or worse on my side of things. What I would say is, first of all, I think the point is really important about the Republican reflexive response of going to the procedure as opposed to the substance, as opposed to the merits. And it always raises the question of, do they lack the courage of their convictions? Are they afraid? And they shouldn't be, because they have a compelling argument on their side. And if they make it in a compelling fashion, that's what politics is about. It's the art of persuasion, and it's about speaking to the core concerns of their constituents. So it's maddening to me always when there's this reflexive response of going to the procedure over the merits. But the only other thing I'll say is, and this is just an observation, and it's the bracing aspect of this, sort of implicit to the conversation, is, do you even need an ERA? Do you even need a constitutional amendment if you're already achieving it by proxy? And unfortunately, I think that's where we are right now. We're quite close to it.
All right, so let's transition to our final segment here. So we are recording this about a week and a half, or just over a week, I guess, after Joe Biden's surprise visit to Kiev. He appears to have been spirited away from Poland. It was like an 11-hour train ride, if I'm not mistaken, there. And somewhat ironically, it was on President's Day, so around the same time that President Trump, to his great credit, was making a trip to East Palestine, Ohio. Joe Biden was over kind of fighting the Davos WEF globalist fight over in Kiev. And Joe Biden used this surprise visit to Ukraine to effectively double down on the U.S.'s commitment. It was an unambiguous sign of unshakable solidarity with Vladimir Zelensky and the Ukrainian government. It was clearly meant to send a very strong signal to Russia. I don't think the United States they didn't apprise Russia of Biden's visit until maybe just I think it was 3 to 4 hours before Biden got there. It was kind of just to, a point of deconfliction to make sure that there was no kind of air traffic or anything like that. Anyway, I wrote my column last week in the aftermath of this surprise visit, kind of using the 1-year anniversary hook of the Russian invasion of Ukraine to ask what I formulated as questions to the Washington Uniparty 1 year in. And those 5 questions in order, and I'll be curious for your guys' thoughts on these questions. And these questions are intended for the Washington Uniparty, kind of the foreign policy blob that Rachel Bovard, of course, loves to refer to. So the first question is, what is the meaning of as long as it takes? Because that is the rhetoric over and over again that we hear, whether it's from the Prime Minister of Finland in Davos recently, whether it's from President Biden himself. These leaders invariably get asked, how long are you going to be committed to supplying Ukraine with money, weapons, guns, butter? And the answer is always as long as it takes. Well, how long actually is as long as it takes? Second question, is the U.S. national interest in the conflict synonymous with Ukraine's national interest? Well, you would think that if you're really, truly committed for as long as it takes, you might think the answer to that is yes. As I've argued on this show many times, I'm not sure the answer is fully yes. It's partial overlap, certainly not full overlap. Third question, is the U.S. fearful of all-out war with Russia? I was discussing this with some elected officials recently. I mean, people don't recognize here that Russia has a bigger nuclear arsenal than the United States as far as kind of actual nuclear weapons. And the discrepancy on paper appears to be relatively small, like roughly about 1,000 or 2. In reality, it's actually quite a bit bigger than that because they were probably cheating on the New START treaty obligations for a very long time. Fourth question, has the U.S. learned anything about endless wars? Seems not to be clear. Final question, what is the U.S.'s long-term plan to deal with Russia? Again, on that final question, what some of us, myself, Roger Kimball, and maybe a handful of others, have said since the get-go is that the actual prudent mid to long-term move here, the mid to long-term move is to recognize that the threat this century is China and to do some sort of reverse Nixonian visit to Beijing, kind of what Richard Nixon did to China in the 1970s, where he was basically trying to slightly kind of peel China away from the Soviet sphere of influence. But the prudence move here in theory, at least when this conflict is over, would be to do somewhat of a reverse. Russia is never going to be kind of fully within the U.S. Western American sphere of influence. Obviously, that would be incredibly naive to think that. But at a bare minimum, we should not be trying to alienate them so much at this point, just poking the bear, refusing to take Ukrainian ascension to NATO off the table. We should have some sort of mid to long-term goal here when it comes to geopolitical relations vis-a-vis Russia. And I just want to reiterate that when it comes to the U.S. national interest at this stage of the conflict, my position on this has not changed at all. I've written like 4 columns on this, 4 or 5, probably since the conflict started. My first couple of columns, I got lambasted on Twitter as some sort of Putin apologist. I actually got way less of that this time, which I think is progress. And the public and the public polling shows that. It shows that Republicans in particular, but Americans in general, are starting to get a little weary when it comes to our politicians' rhetoric, and who can blame them? The U.S. taxpayer dished off about $113 billion in taxpayer funds to Ukraine last year, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. We have no idea where that money is going, I might add. But I just want to emphasize here, and then I will toss it open to the group for your thoughts on those questions, on Biden's visits, whatever you want to touch on. The U.S. national interest in this conflict is primarily to keep Zelensky, no matter what his flaws, and he is clearly quite flawed, but as between him and a Belarusian Lukashenko-style Moscow puppet state, we take Zelensky. I've said that repeatedly since the Russian invasion. The key point here is that right now, where Ukraine and Russia are squabbling, and where they have been squabbling for months and months on end, is in the Donbass region, where it's ethnically split Russian-Ukrainian. So I don't get it. I don't get what the point of this as long as it takes rhetoric is to kind of decide the fate of these various Donbass communities. But maybe someone here disagrees with me. I don't know.
Well, let me just say, a couple things. I mean, when you say you don't know what the point is, obviously, there's a pecuniary interest among some in the rebuilding effort, and Ukraine there's always been pecuniary motives for U.S. involvement in Ukraine, and that's the more nefarious kind of look at this. Between that and the idea that Zelensky is Winston Churchill and that this is about stopping Hitler, I think there's reality, and we have to look at all the motives and the nature of all the actors on the ground and then weigh the rhetoric against what's actually happening. But I want to go to your first question of as long as it takes. My response to that question is another question. As long as what takes? And from the start, and we've discussed this here several times, it's never been clear what the desired endpoint is, at what cost, and then what the exit strategy would be to the extent we got to that endpoint, because it should be called an exit strategy when you consider that we are de facto at war here. I don't know at what thresholds in terms of billions of dollars or size, scope, and scale of the weapons that we're giving constitute being at war, but effectively we are in a proxy war with Russia here, and it should be stated as such and understood as such. And then that gets to the question of why is it in our compelling national interest to be as involved as we are? And I still have not heard a compelling argument. The notion that Vladimir Putin was going to suddenly not just take over the Ukraine, but then march in and knock over other states in some kind of domino effect in Eastern Europe and beyond is belied by the fact that Russia has gotten so weighed down in Ukraine. And maybe you say that's a consequence of the U.S. effort and those of our partners and allies to back Ukraine. But those partners and allies themselves would be implicated if Putin were to have overtaken Ukraine and then tried to move forward. So he would have been stopped regardless. So, that argument, and I think, by the way, it's a foolhardy argument, because I think Vladimir Putin knows that even if he did want to not just bring back the band with the Soviet Union, but try to go beyond that, he knows that Russia punches above its weight, but that it does lack by any substantial number of measures in strength, with the exception of, as Josh noted, that trump card of nuclear weapons. So, these very basic questions about, what's in our compelling national interest, at what cost, what the end game is it realistic? If the end game is to depose Vladimir Putin, who do you think follows him? And what probability odds do we put on his successor being potentially worse? Or the chaos of the nuclear weapons that could potentially be unsecured in a scenario like that? All of these things are not even talked about. The whole conflict is framed in simply freedom and democracy versus authoritarian Hitlerianism. And that does a disservice to how significant our involvement in the conflict is, and how significant the conflict is in general. And the last thing I'll say is, what's the opportunity cost? And you'll note that in dealing with Trump-Russia collusion for more than 4 years, and continuing now with 2+ years dealing with Russia, Russia has been the serious focus of our national security and foreign policy establishment for 6+ years. And while there is an argument to be made, I think, as seen with the Select Committee in Congress, that there is some bipartisan agreement that China is the real threat and the real adversary that we ought to be focusing on, that's belied by the billions of dollars in resources, the weaponry, and obviously all the other costs associated with a proxy war with Russia over Ukraine right now, or de facto proxy war with Russia, all of which is a massive diversion of resources, time, effort, and focus from the far greater threat. We may never even get to trying to effectuate some kind of reverse Sino-Soviet split when we've gotten so bogged down as China continues its march to be the hegemonic world power.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the end game is here. And I don't think our government knows what the end game here is, short of citing regime change. We know that they scuttled peace talks, not just the United States, but others were involved in scuttling peace talks about a year ago, last March. I think those reports are really disturbing, and I don't think anybody's actually really answered from them yet. That said, I do think another thing we're thinking about really hard is learning some of those lessons of the Cold War and absorbing them from some really other quagmires, basically some other quagmires in recent American history. And I am increasingly interested in the argument that you're drawing out this conflict for the ambiguous goals of the political establishment in the United States, which don't seem to be very clear. It is prolonging the trauma, the tragedy, and the conflict for the people of Ukraine, and that there is a sort of peace through strength immediate future. I don't trust the Biden administration to implement that one bit, because I don't think they're clear about what their end goal might be. I would be much more interested in that argument, frankly, if the Biden administration said, we're willing to talk about these terms, X, Y, and Z, those terms, X, Y, and Z. But as of right now, it does feel like we're settling into a quagmire that will prolong the conflict, and that some folks in the defense establishment will profit from, and that will ultimately be counter to the aims of the American people.
So it falls on me to make the rebuttal, and I think it's clear that I disagree with most people with whom I normally agree with on this particular issue. Starting with the U.S. interest, I think it's important not always to fight the last war. And while it's important to learn lessons from the last wars, I don't think that it's necessary. Like, the history doesn't exactly repeat itself every time. There's no immediately applicable. So, like, in other words, there is a danger, a corresponding danger of over applying the lesson of one situation which may not apply in another one. Second, the U.S. interest, I think this idea of a reverse Nixonian, goes to China thing is has pipe dream. Basically, from the start, maybe 4 or 5 years ago was possible, but I think it's very clear China and Russia are now very closely aligned. Despite all of their history of hating each other, we know this was true in during the Cold War and remains true today. So, oh no, it's unstable again. My internet connection. Can you hear me? Sorry. So I think this idea of reverse Nixoning the situation, if it were ever possible, it hasn't been possible already for several years. And with that in mind, I think it is in the U.S. national interest to do two things vis-a-vis China. One, Ukraine is a very fertile, farmland. China is a very food poor empire, right? And I think that's really important. One of the main things that Russia can offer to China is a very stable source of grain and food. So it is not good for the U.S. national interest vis-a-vis China, for example, to have someone like, as Josh pointed out, a Lukashenko-like character who is directly doing the bidding of Moscow in Ukraine. So that's obvious. And then the second U.S. national interest is very clearly to expose Russia and power, as was prior to this war. I think that does have lessons that, in fact, the U.S. military may very well be, and we've talked about this in the past in other contexts of like the wokeness in our military, may very well be the tallest midget here by quite a bit, despite all of our problems. And I think that communicating that and having the Russians communicate that by failing to invade what is on paper a much weaker country, failing in that invasion, I think that is in the U.S. national interest. And so finally, I think there's a lot of sort of downplaying of Ukrainian agency here. I don't agree that this is a proxy war. In fact, initially, in the first 3 weeks of the invasion, it was basically only down to Ukraine. I think that actually Putin's plan to quickly topple the government in Kyiv would have worked quite well. I think he read the West quite well in terms of thinking that this was going to be more like his incursions into Georgia, right, and South Ossetia. And that the West response would be delayed and weak, and he was counting on the fact that the Ukrainians would roll over for this invasion. That didn't happen, and they were able to stave it out on their own for the first 3 or 4 weeks, which allowed the West to mount the kind of response that we have been able to mount. So I actually think he read the weakness of the West quite well. I think what he didn't read was the agency of Ukrainians here. And finally, I do find it a little bit funny that apparently, and this goes both directions, Ukrainian nationalism is the single nationalism that is acceptable to the left, right? Obviously, American nationalism and our own borders, very much unacceptable, fascist, blah, blah, blah. But of course, Ukrainian nationalism, we're going to fly the Ukrainian flag. They're still showing up on the buildings here in New York. Now, I'm open to, I think some of Josh's questions were very reasonable. I think it's reasonable to ask what the limits of U.S. engagement would be. It's reasonable to cover nuclear arsenal. I think those are, and asking why this is in our national interest is a question and is something we should very much learn, is a lesson that we should learn from the past and our involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that being said, I'll return to my top question. It's not going to necessarily yield the same answers in every conflict. I don't have like a ideology, I guess, in foreign policy. I think the answers to those questions will be different in every single conflict. So with that rebuttal, I'll kick it back for final thoughts.
I know we all have thoughts on that one, but I will open it up to everyone else for their final thoughts and in general. Who wants to go first?
So I'll be brief in response, and then Josh will probably have a more robust response. But I just wanted to clarify my position, to be clear. And I've been writing about Vladimir Putin for almost a decade. View him as an adversary. Obviously, Russia is an adversary. The notion that America was going to negotiate some kind of legitimate, serious partnership with Russia, I think has always been dubious. Let's not forget that Putin, I believe, was the first world leader to contact George W. Bush after 9/11 to himself try to curry favor with the U.S. and work in counterterror. Obviously, you can't trust Vladimir Putin and you can't trust the Russian government, but anything would have been better than the pact that has now been sealed between Russia and China, where Russia is the junior partner and China is the senior partner in that relationship. And I do think that Donald Trump would have truly tried to effectuate some kind of reverse split there before the two sides had even come together. And maybe, I'm tentatively optimistic that it could have worked, or at least something like a more positive relationship would have worked to keep Russia and China at arm's length. But on the notion of not a proxy war, I guess my question would be, when you have over $100 billion committed to an engagement and seemingly an endless blank check, and you have your leaders talking about regime change, sometimes very explicitly and the like, and whatever it takes, and the weapons being transferred, what would a proxy war look like if this isn't what a proxy war looks like? Does it have to be U.S. boots actually on the ground fighting? We're obviously providing actionable intelligence and the like. And by the way, none of that is to say that I don't want Ukraine to ultimately triumph over Russia and push Vladimir Putin back. And I wouldn't love to see ultimately someday Vladimir Putin fall and Russia actually be a free and open country that's not aligned with China. Certainly, Ukrainian nationalism is just fine. And hopefully it triumphs over Vladimir Putin's more empire-driven sorts of efforts. But my only point is, it's never been articulated clearly what the end point is, how we expect to achieve it, what the exit strategy is, at what cost are we willing to endure in connection with this conflict. And so, I want Ukraine to triumph over Russia, but I question at what cost for the U.S. and to what end ultimately, and can we really trust our leaders to level with us, particularly given that they've never leveled with us and don't show any interest in giving us any transparency into where the billions have gone and the extent of our interest in whatever the mission is, still not yet defined. So hence my skepticism, but certainly would love to see, Russia fall and fail.
Sure. I never mentioned regime change in Russia for a reason. I don't really believe in regime change in Russia, or at least that anything coming out of that country is going to be like some kind of ally to the United States. And the reason and just briefly, the reason I said proxy war, I don't think fits here. And maybe it's not what you meant, but there is a connotation to proxy war that like the US is making all of the decisions or even sparked this war or had some, essentially that the US is in the driver's seat when it comes to the decisions made by Ukraine. I don't think that's actually an accurate characterization of what's happening here. And in fact, I think there are probably multiple, and contrary to the reports about that, and I still don't know the truth of those that Emily brought up in March about peace talks. I think oftentimes it's the reverse, that the U.S. is sort of the reluctant partner, and that Ukrainians have more aggressive ambitions than the U.S. is willing to support. So the dynamic actually goes the opposite direction in many of these cases. Now, it's difficult to tell who exactly. Maybe it'll all come out, and I certainly don't trust our own government. But I think it's important to recognize that how we think of like all of our domestic problems and how we think about the battles in the United States and our ultimate disappointment, and I think all four of us share this kind of fatigue with the idea of liberal democracy, given that we do seem to live under like a kind of technocratic woke oligarchy now. Right. So I think we are very fatigued with this language of liberal democracy. I don't think that's true in Eastern Europe, in part because they're always, 20 to 30 years behind the West. So I don't think that like I think that language hits very differently in that part of the world. And we have to be careful not to project how we think about our own government now onto the actions of other people, or other peoples, I should say.
Final thoughts from you, Josh?
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree that at this point, kind of a reverse Nixon to China is probably a very difficult to maneuver. It would have been slightly less difficult at least 14 months ago. It would have been a heck of a lot more difficult if the U.S. and the West in general had made a series of different decisions after the fall of the Soviet Union. look, the literal purpose, the purpose of NATO expired in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. What have we done with NATO since then? I mean, literally as recently as last year, we were voting to re-add Sweden and Finland as yet more additional countries. And the West has continued to take off Ukrainian ascension to NATO off the table. I mean, in 2014, when it comes to the Maidan Revolution, I don't pretend to be an expert, but I've read a decent amount about what happened there in Ukraine in 2014. I think it looks like to a lot of people like a Western color revolution of sorts. So
that's the part I completely just factually disagree with. There's a difference between the U.S. supporting like publicly making statements about protest movements as it has in a bunch of different places, right?
It's a lot more than statements, according to many knowledgeable people, including many who were on the ground and people that I personally know who were there on the ground and who I've talked to about what happened there. I also know a lot of people who are on the ground who were coming out and having nothing to do with the CIA or the United States. So that is the angle that I disagree with. Even if all of that was happening, this is actually an organic, even in 2014, was an organic movement. And the fact that the U.S., I mean, we have our tendrils and often very what do you call it, ineffectively, right? I wish we were more effective in our purpose if we had, good ones, but often very ineffective. And I think Inez, let me ask you a very simple question. Would you be willing to send your hypothetical child to go die in the Donbass to fight for Ukrainian nationalism?
No, but I don't think that's an option that's on the table. I don't think, and if it were proposed that U.S. would put boots on the ground in Ukraine, I would oppose that too. But we support all kinds of interests all around the world. And it seems funny to me that this interest is the one.
Do we support interests all around the world with Abrams tanks and Patriot missile defense systems?
Huh?
Do we support conflicts all over the world with M1 Abrams tanks and Patriot missile defense systems to the tune of over $100 billion in U.S. taxpayer aid annually to defend one of the most corrupt regimes on earth?
We do send, as you pointed out yourself, we do send, we send plenty of aid of both material and of billions of dollars. Now, maybe some of that also should be reevaluated. But I do find it interesting that this is the one aid. And actually, I think this is aid that is going to people who are willing to fight for themselves, which is something we saw totally collapse in Afghanistan, even after 20 years, right? I'm opposed to boots on the ground in Ukraine as well, but I haven't seen anyone propose that U.S. soldiers be sent to Ukraine.
Well, a lot of people are at least talking about getting that $113 billion annually down. Look, at the end of the day, the Republican Party and the conservative movement has a choice to make. Josh Hawley had a tweet recently that I think was emphatically correct, which is the Republican Party has a choice to be the party of visiting Kiev on President's Day weekend or the party of East Palestine, Ohio. That is the fundamental question. That is the question. Globalism versus nationalism is obviously hovering in the background there. I think you've heard two perspectives in this particular podcast, and I hope that it comes out one way and not the other.
I will say it was enjoyable watching MSNBC play interviews that they conducted in Crimea yesterday. I think I was watching this on Katie Tur's show, and they were interviewing, it was like a 73-year-old Crimean woman, and asked her if she was Russian or Ukrainian, and she said, Russian, of course. And so there are some uncomfortable truths that I think the media is dealing with that I think it's just, we have not been served well by the media coverage. And I think that's because both of these perspectives that were just fleshed out are not well represented in the press. Even Inez's argument isn't coming from sort of a neoconservative hawkish position. It's much more nuanced than what we hear the defense contractors peddling on cable news airwaves. So on that note, my final thought is that everybody is wrong except for me. I'm kidding. Well, am I? I don't know. My final thought is that was a great conversation. So on behalf of Ben, Inez, Josh, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.